Oh, what a blessing it is to be in the house of the Lord, feel His presence, to hear His words to us. And actually, funny story about this message, because back in April, I misread the schedule, and I was all geared up to speak, and I was getting into the parking lot, and I had my thoughts and everything kind of aligned to what I was going to speak, what I felt the Lord speaking, and then Pastor Frank graciously greeted me in the parking lot and mentioned that I wasn't up to speak that day. So I was like, oh, okay. So, but I do feel that this message is from the Lord to us today, and almost a calling or a call to action of sorts. And so I want to speak today on the 11th hour workers. The 11th hour workers. And the phrase, the 11th hour, we typically find that phrase defined as the last possible moment before it's too late. We could think of it as the last minute, high time, the final hour. And so there's a somewhat of a sense of urgency here. A sense of urgency. And so as I was putting this message together a couple months back, I believe that we're coming to the close out of a dispensation. I believe that we're coming to the end of the church age, and we don't know the exact timing. We don't pretend to know that, but we know that we are closer than we've ever been. And the signs of the times are all around us. A few years ago, we witnessed a global event in COVID that impacted the entire earth. It impacted the entire earth, and there was just very small seedlings of what I believe is coming on a global scale in COVID, because there was an attempt at power grabs. There was an attempt to shut down the churches globally, and all in the name of health and not getting sick, which there were different things that happened during that event that I think were just precursors to what's coming. And then we seen in October of 2023, the world witnessed with horror the attack upon Israel by Hamas. And one of the things that event kind of opened the door to was, you can very clearly see now that nations are beginning to give their stance on whether they're in support or in opposition to Israel. And so I believe that these two events are just only the beginning of sorrows spoken of in Matthew 24. They're just the precursor events to what we're going to see on a global scale. And both of these events really shook the entire earth and were shakings. And so we can see that the stage is being set for the climax of the church age. And I believe that we are in the 11th hour, as it were, of when the Lord is going to move. We're on the precipice of global events happening, of God moving upon His church, of the greatest revival that the earth has ever known, but also the greatest darkness that will come upon the earth. And so today we're going to consider this thought of the 11th hour. And I want to turn our attention to the parable of the laborers in the vineyard. The laborers in the vineyard. And this is found in Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. And we're not going to read through all of these verses today, but if we read through this parable here, we find that the owner of this vineyard, he went out to hire laborers to work his vineyard. And so all throughout the day, he's rounding up his workers. Says that early in the day, at the third hour, he went out and he found those who were waiting to be hired. And then he went out again in the 6th hour, and then he went out again in the 9th hour. And finally, he came even to the 11th hour. He was going out to hire laborers to work his vineyard. And this is like the 11th hour is really the last hour before sunset. And in Jewish time, it'd be the last hour of the day, kind of 5 p.m., and it's really extremely unusual for someone to go out 1 hour before the end of the day and hire workers, and yet there was a need for workers even at the end of the day. And we find, if we continue on in this story, we find that when it comes time for everyone to be paid, those who were employed in the last hour, of the 11th hour, received the same wage as those who had been employed all day. And that caused a bit of a stir, and there was some grumbling and arguing that those who had been working all day should be paid more. And really that's not the point of this message today, but where I want to focus on, because this parable could be interpreted in many different ways, but what I want to hone in on today is just this thought of being chosen by God in the 11th hour. And I believe, like I said, that we're in the 11th hour of the church age, and God is actively looking for those who will be put into his service, to see some of the greatest culmination that the world has ever seen in God's kingdom. And we know that it's, as we sing today, it's all for his glory. It's all for his honor. And from Pastor Dan's book on the Tabernacle of David, he mentions that the 11th hour workers can represent those that have been allowed by God to deal with issues in their lives. They have been willing to be deprived. They have endured long seasons of barrenness. And if we actually read these verses in Matthew chapter 20, verses 6 through 7, Matthew chapter 20, verses 6 through 7, it says, "And about the 11th hour he went out and found others standing idle, and saith unto them, Why stand ye here all the day idle?" And another word for that word idle in the Greek could be barren. "Why stand you here all the day barren?" In verse 7, they say unto him, "Because no man hath hired us." No man hath hired us. And so really I want to focus in on this thought of, even if it seems that you're not bearing the fruit that you desire in your life, or the fruit's not there in the matter of people or a prosperous ministry, that the Lord is testing your heart. He's testing your heart. And that could come down to a personal level. Maybe you feel that you don't quite have the fruit to present to the Lord that you desire in your hearts. And it could be a time of barrenness. And yet the Lord is looking upon those who will be faithful through that time. And all throughout Scripture we find that it is those who have endured the barrenness that the promises are fulfilled through. And this is not, when you consider the world, this is not ever a message that would resonate with anyone in the world, because if you're successful, then you're going to have money and affluence and riches and those types of things. And so this message here is going against that thought that even though there might be barrenness in your life, it could be that God is looking for those who will be faithful even in the difficulties, even if in the hardest of times. And if we consider just a few examples today, we could think of the barrenness of Abraham and Sarah, right? They were given a promise. Abraham, when he was 75, was given a promise that he would have a son that would give him fruit for eternity, that all nations would be blessed through him. And yet he was 75 years old, and that promise did not come to pass until he was 99 years of age. And so his wife was barren in a sense of the promises of God up until that point. And yet we know that because of their faithfulness, because they staggered not in unbelief, it says in Hebrews, that Abraham and Sarah are still inheriting the promises of God to this day. We could also consider the the forerunner of Christ, John the Baptist, and how he too was the product of a barren mother, Elizabeth. And she produced a son in her old age. And his message, just like us, his message was to prepare the way for Christ's coming. And he was preparing the way for Christ's first coming upon the earth. And God is preparing a people who will prepare the message for the way for the second coming of Christ. And so we looked at those two examples, but really for the rest of this message, I want to consider the example of Joseph, And the Lord was speaking to me about how Joseph was the 11th son of Jacob. He was the 11th son of Jacob. He too was a product of a barren mother. His mother was Rachel, and we know that there was many, many years where she cried out for a child, and yet she was barren. And he was not the firstborn child, and yet many of the promises of the double portion were given to Joseph because he was faithful to the message that God had given him. So the first thing I want to bring out today in the life of Joseph along this point of the 11th hour workers is that Joseph was given a dream. He was given a vision for his life. And we know very well he was given a prophetic dream that ultimately he was going to be placed in a position of leadership and authority in his family and in the land, and all of his brothers and his parents even would be subject unto him. And yet we find that right away this vision was challenged, right? He was thrown in a pit by his brothers. He was sold into slavery. He was put into prison. And it seemed that through every circumstance that he went through, he did not charge God foolishly. He held on to that vision in his life. He held on to that promise, because otherwise he probably would have given up. When he was thrown into the pit and he's thinking back of that vision, he was considering maybe that the Lord is not finished with me yet. And then he was faithful. As a slave, he was faithful, and he was sold into the house of Potiphar, and he was faithful in all that he was given. And when he was tested with Potiphar's wife, he was faithful. And he was faithful in the prison, and he was elevated even in the prison. And so even though we may feel that the vision is like all of the things that God has spoken to us are not coming to pass, God is looking for us to be faithful, to hold on in belief to the promises he's given us. And I believe that Joseph clung to the promises of God. I believe that with all my heart, that through all of the dangers, toils, and snares that he went through, he remembered that God had given him those dreams, and that held him through all of those things. And so I want to consider a verse today in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 24 through 26. And we're going to look at this in the ESV version if we could here. But it says, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly." We'll stop there for a minute. So I do not run aimlessly. And I want to kind of tie this thought of not running aimlessly to running with our race with a vision. The choices and the decisions that we make in life are continually bringing us closer to something each and every day. And sometimes it's those small decisions, those small acts of obedience that are really qualifying us for greater obediences. And recently I had the privilege of watching the Chariots of Fire at the the lovely Aunt Jane and Pastor's house. And one of the most famous quotes of that entire movie is when Eric Liddell states, "When I run, I feel his pleasure. When I run, I feel his pleasure." And so we want to be running in the right direction in our walk with Christ. We want our steps, every step, to be bringing pleasure to the Lord. And if we look back at that verse in 1 Corinthians, it talks about how athletes in the natural, they run to obtain a perishable crown, but we're running to obtain eternal riches, eternal rewards. And ultimately our reward, even as we sang today, was that we may win Christ. I mean, there couldn't ever be a greater reward in life than winning Christ. And actually, it's kind of cute, but Lucy and I came this morning to church a little bit earlier, and Lucy and I were just talking on the way here, and she's sometimes more spiritual than I am, but she was talking about how one day we're going to meet Christ, and even from a young age, I think it's in a child's heart that they could see Jesus, and really that's just such a beautiful vision to set before our eyes for eternity, that we can come to know Christ more and more every day, and ultimately to live with him for eternity, to be with him. And in 2 Samuel chapter 18, we find the story of two runners, and the two runners were Ahimaaz and Cushi. And they were both running with a message from the battlefield. They were bringing a message to the king. And Cushi had the eyewitness report of the battle. So he was bringing to the king what he knew happened, what he could understand, and an eyewitness testimony. And Ahimaaz really wanted to run with a message to the king as well, but he didn't see anything. He wasn't observing what Cushi observed, and so he ran, and he actually made it to the king first, but he didn't have a message. And so the king's waiting for, they send out to get these messengers to come and give him a report of what's going on in the battle. And Ahimaaz gets there, and he's all out of breath, and the king's like, what's going on? What's going on? And he doesn't, he's like, oh, I don't really have anything to say. And King David just says, then I don't have any use for you. If you don't have the message, then why did you even run? And then we know, of course, Cushi came and he spilled out the eyewitness report. And so just this thought to remind us that we have to run with a vision. We don't want to just run aimlessly here and there. We want to run with a vision. And 2 years ago in youth camp, I did this little object lesson where I picked the fastest runner in the room, and they have kind of a pew set up like this too. And then I picked the smallest child to basically just walk up the aisle. And I said, let's see who makes it to the end first. Like, the one is just walking. They knew exactly where they were going to go. The other one was running as fast as he could through the pews, here and there and everywhere. And obviously the one that walked just a straight line and they knew where they were going made it there much quicker than the person that was trying to go every which way and run as fast as they could through the pews. And so just this thought that if we have a vision ever before us, that we can run with a vision and accomplish the things that God is purposing for us. In Proverbs chapter 29, verse 18, it says, "Where there is no vision, the people perish." People perish. And so we're very comfortable with this verse, right? Growing up in Zion, we hear it all the time that we need to have a progressive vision for our lives. that we need to day by day be putting our steps forward towards something. Because if we do not, the result is going to be compromise, confusion, disorder, and oftentimes rebellion. And in horse racing, I don't really know much about horse racing, but one thing I do know is that many times what they do is they put what's called blinders or blinkers on the horse. And the reason for this is because it keeps the horse focused on what's in front of them, rather than getting distracted by the crowd or the other horses in the race, or even just, when you race, sometimes the temptation can be to look behind you and you lose your momentum and your focus. And so we want spiritually to have blinders on in our spiritual walk that cause us not to be distracted to the left or the right, but to be focused on what God has for us. And the enemy wants to present distractions. I think it was Pastor Frank who mentioned that if Satan had a vocation, it would be a marketing genius, because his desire is to constantly get his people, or the people of the world, distracted by things that do not matter. And oftentimes there's going to be things that are vying for your time, your energy, and your attention. And, there might be times where you have to ask the Lord to redirect your focus, redirect your purpose to those things that are in His will for your life. And there's going to be times when people are not going to agree with your choices in life. I know there's been times when I have had to make some decisions that I lost friends over. I know there was, when I was getting out of high school, I made some decisions that to go on with the Lord. I went to Bible school, and I lost some friends because I was no longer goofing around constantly and just trying to have a good time, but I wanted to go on with the Lord. And so there's going to be times when there might be some separation, and it's not always easy, and yet we have to be okay with this because the Lord is calling us to walk a separate life. And we find in Habakkuk chapter 2, or Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 2 and 3, where it says, "And the Lord answered me and said, Write the vision and make it plain upon tables, that he may run that readeth it. For the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it shall not speak, or it shall speak and not lie. Though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come. It will not tarry." And so I kind of want to break this verse down a little bit here, but just this thought of write the vision and make it plain. And really, I believe we know in our church and in our fellowship in Zion, we try to do this continually to make the vision plain, because that's what we feel the Lord has called us to. That's His will for our lives. In the vision of Zion, it's very clear the Lord is calling us to His holiness. He's calling us to go on with Him. He's calling us to allow Him to work in the depth in our lives. And we think about this calling, and it's actually, it can be labeled sometimes as an exclusive calling, but it's actually an invitation for the entire church to go on to His holiness. And in Hebrews, it talks about how you have not come unto Mount Sinai, but you've come unto Mount Zion. And that's the thing about Mount Zion, is it's the place where God dwells. And really, so this calling is to become more like Christ, to every day be asking the Lord to come a little bit higher and to come closer, to sanctify us more and more. And we're not going to spend too much time on this, but there's this thought of being born in Zion. In Psalm chapter 87, verse 5, Psalm chapter 87, verse 5, and it says, "And of Zion it shall be said, This and that man was born in her, and the highest himself shall establish her. So what does it mean to be born in Zion, spiritual Mount Zion we're talking about? It's to answer the call to walk upon the highway to holiness, to lay aside those things, those distractions, those things that are going to take our eyes off Christ, to fully hit the mark that he has for our lives, and to not compromise or settle for things that are not his full will for our lives. And really, this is the message of the cross. This is not something that you hear preached every day because it desires, or it requires more so, a level of attention. It requires sacrifice. It requires to die daily to the flesh. And so this is a message for the church, but not many are not going to answer that call because they don't want to surrender. And I think that we need to be those who, because we've been exposed to this calling in our lives, that we need to continually come to the Lord, because it's not all sunshine and rainbows. The message of holiness is difficult, and it requires an added measure of the grace of God in our lives. But as we come to him continually, he can work that out in our hearts. And the next thought of this call to Zion can be found in Psalm chapter 15 and Psalm 24. And so there's a calling to Zion, to be born in Zion, spiritual Mount Zion we're talking about, which is God's holiness for his people. But then there's this thought of ascending the hill of Zion, so coming up the hill of Zion. We find that in Psalm chapter 24. And then there's the thought of remaining in Zion. So once maybe the Lord has brought you to a place where you can say that you're living in spiritual Mount Zion, God wants us to remain there. And so I think it's important for us to visit these chapters now and again, to ask the Lord to help us to apply these truths. And quickly here, I just want to bring out this thought of the blessings of being born in spiritual Mount Zion. We can find in Psalm chapter 125, verse 1, "They that trust in the Lord shall be as Mount Zion, which cannot be removed, but abideth forever." And so there is this thought of being planted, being supported, being unshakable, unmovable. And we talked about how there's great shakings coming upon the earth, and so we want to be those who are planted in our inheritance. We want to be those who are unable to be tossed about by the winds of doctrine that will come against the church. We want to be those who are planted in Mount Zion. Psalm chapter 87, verse 2. Psalm chapter 87, verse 2, it says, "The Lord loveth the gates of Zion more than all the dwellings of Jacob." And really the thought here is that the Lord loves when his people come close to him. He wants, his desires for all of us to come and to be transformed into his image, to surrender our will, to surrender our hearts to coming to be more like Christ. And that just brings us to the last verse I want to highlight here, Psalm chapter 132, verses 13 and 14. It says, "For the Lord hath chosen Zion, he has desired it for his habitation. This is my rest forever. Here will I dwell, for I have desired it." And so there's this thought here of coming into our rest in our spiritual walk. And this is, once again, where God dwells. He longs for his people to come and be with him where he dwells. And so that requires some cleaning up, some cleansing that needs to take place in our lives to become more like Christ. And so this is the first thought of the vision that we have in Zion, and making it, writing it plain, making it clear to us. And the second thought is to take part in fulfilling the Great Commission to teach all nations the gospel of the kingdom of God. We know very well the Great Commission to go and teach all nations, teach them to observe the gospel of Christ. And in Matthew chapter 24, verse 14, it says, "And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then the end shall come." And so we know that there's a job for the church that's still very much needed to be filled at this time. And as I was doing some research, there's this online resource that's called the Joshua Project. And what their intent is to really just track worldwide, globally, track the people groups of the world to figure out who has been exposed to the gospel. Who has been exposed to the gospel. And their current estimate right now is that 1.9 billion people have never been exposed to the gospel. There's no Bible in their language. There's no missionaries or anything established in the sense of a Christian church. And so that's 2 million people. That's almost a quarter of the population of the earth that has never heard the gospel. And so this is why it's so important to be plugged into missions, to be plugged into supporting missions, and to travel and to be a part of something that is getting the word out to the world. And we know in Zion, obviously, Pastor Bailey has made it very clear that what the Lord spoke to him was that he desired to have a Bible school in every nation. And we currently have over 100 Bible schools in the Fellowship of Zion in over 40 nations, and our desire is to continue to see that increase. We want to continue to be a part of this Great Commission to plant the Word of God throughout the earth. And so I was actually looking at some analytics from our YouTube channel, and it's pretty amazing because we have been very blessed to produce videos and put them out there, and this wasn't always available to kind of spread the gospel in that manner, but we have viewers from Oman. I've never even really heard of that place. I had to look it up on a map to see where it was, but it's very close to Saudi Arabia. There was people that tuned in from the Philippines, Australia, Malaysia, Nigeria, South Africa, Sri Lanka, and many other countries have tuned in to some of our YouTube messages. And so just the beauty of the gospel spreading in ways that maybe we've never seen before. And so we want to continue to be a part of that. And as a congregant in our church, you may not ever go out on the mission field, but you can support the missions through prayer. You can support missions through giving. You can support the local church and be a part of, the kids' church and the worship and the sound. All of those things are supporting the work to send people out to the world. And if we flip back here to Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 3, it says, "The vision is yet for an appointed time." The vision is yet for an appointed time. And we think back to Joseph's scenario. And God gave Joseph that vision, and God knew exactly when that dream was going to come to pass, but Joseph did not. And the last part of that verse, it says, though it tarry, and the word there is mawa, which means delay or linger. So though the vision lingers, it says wait for it, because it will surely come. And then it almost seems like it contradicts itself in this verse, because it says it will not tarry. But that word tarry at the end is actually a different word. It's actually the word akar, which means be late. So though it tarry, though it linger, wait for it, because it will surely come. It will not be late. And we're talking about God's timetable here. It will come to pass as we wait for it. And so often the test of time is what causes people to get sick and tired of waiting around. But we have to remember that when there's a promise or a vision that's given, it's God who's on trial. It's God who's on trial. Are we going to take him at his word, or are we going to look and say, this is never going to come to pass? And we've been praying for the same thing for 20, 30, 40 years, and we haven't seen it fulfilled. And yet, God is true to his word. What he says will come to pass, will come to pass. And he is oftentimes a God of the 11th hour. And so it might seem like it's never going to happen, and yet God brings it to pass in the 11th hour. And so Joseph, he held on. He did not give up hope, and because of that, the promises of God were fulfilled in his life. And Isaiah chapter 61, verse 7, Isaiah chapter 61, verse 7, it says, "For your shame ye shall have double, and for confusion they shall rejoice in their portion. Therefore in the land they shall possess the double. Everlasting joy shall be unto them." And so it might seem like things are very small. We spoke a message a few months back about not to despise the day of small things. And yet God is looking for his people that will be faithful, even in the times of barrenness, even in the times where it seems like everything is starting to die. I just recently noticed an interview. I came across an interview that was talking about how many churches are closing their doors. And I was very disheartened because many churches, and I mean, even if we consider our own church here, we're very small in numbers. And many churches are seeing that as an opportunity to close their doors. And there are times maybe that certain churches have to close, but it seems as if globally that people are casting off restraint. They're closing their doors. They're not coming to church anymore. I think COVID was something that really actually caused many churches, congregants, to actually not come to church anymore. Now they're attending via live stream, which is okay, but I feel the Lord doesn't want his people to forsake the assembling of coming to church. And so we want to hold fast. We want to hold strong to not forsake the assembling of each other in church. And we're going to look at this second part in closing here of this verse in 1 Corinthians here. The second part of this verse, so we talked about I do not run aimlessly and running with a vision. And in the second part of this verse in 1 Corinthians 9:26, the second part of that says, I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body, I keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. And so there's just this thought of making your blows count. Making your blows count. And I believe that the Lord is calling his church to come together and to make our blows count. He wants us to do damage to the enemy in spiritual warfare, in prayer, in our times of worship and in praise, that strongholds will come down as we seek him, as we pray for deliverance and healing and to set the captives free. And this is all coming, but God is calling his people to come together and make their blows count. And we sing that song, Jesus, bring revival and start the work in me. And so the church is made up of families that are made up of individuals. And if we want revival in our lands, it has to start in us. It has to start with us seeking the Lord in our own lives, that the Lord would would break down any walls of separation, break down sin in our lives that holds us back from him, to cleanse our hearts, to wake us up for his purposes, to call us on and bring us into deeper truth and revelation. So the Lord is, I believe, stirring up our hearts today. I want to maybe ask Marlon to come and we'll do a song here, but I want to pray that the Lord would begin to stir up our hearts, to see principalities, to see strongholds come down in our city, in our nation, in our land. In Psalm chapter 105, verse 21 and 22, and this is speaking of Joseph, it says, "He made him lord of his house and ruler of all his substance, to bind his princes at his pleasure and teach his senators wisdom." And in the natural here, there's this thought of Joseph had an authority to basically bind princes naturally, but I feel that he also had something in the spirit that he could obtain a power and the ability to bind things in the spirit realm. And so in professional boxing, there's 12 rounds. And as I was preparing for this message, I felt the Lord speaking to me that the church is coming into that 11th round where we really need to see some major blows to the enemy. We need to see some victories. We need to see some breakthroughs in our lives, in our churches, in our families. And the harvest truly is great. The harvest truly is great, and the Lord is looking for those who will be faithful in the 11th hour. And so I'm going to ask Marlon to come. Do you have a song here, Marlon?